Welcome to the latest episode in our annual lecture series, the Civic Discourse Project, where the school hosts conversations on the pressing issues of our time. I'm Paul Carisse. I'm the director of the School of Civic and Economic Thought and Leadership here at Arizona State University. This season of the Civic Discourse Project is focusing on citizenship and civic leadership in America. We're trying to identify the ingredients necessary for civic literacy and also informed participation. It's my pleasure to welcome our two distinguished guests, Sarah Elliott, the former communications director for the Garcia for Governor campaign, and Daniel Scarpinato, a senior advisor for the Ducey for Governor campaign in 2018. And we also welcome my co-moderator for tonight's discussion, Maria Polletta from the Arizona Republic, a government and politics reporter. Please join me in welcoming our guests. Sarah Elliott is the Arizona Director for the Impact Project. In 2018, she worked as Communications Director for the David Garcia for Governor campaign. She formerly has worked as Senior Advisor for the Martin Heinrich for U.S. Senate campaign in New Mexico and for the New Mexico Democratic Party. Sarah has served as Communications Director for Montana Governor Brian Schweitzer for 2 terms, where she worked on a range of policy issues as well as communications with the legislature on the state budget, on policy, on other legislative action. Prior to her tenure with Governor Schweitzer, she had served in the press office of then Denver Mayor, later Colorado Governor John Hickenlooper. She also has worked as a reporter and editor at an NBC affiliate and as communications director for private sector companies. Daniel Scarpinato is Chief of Staff to Arizona Governor Doug Ducey, a position he has held since December of 2018. Daniel previously served as Governor Ducey's Deputy Chief of Staff for Communications and Strategic Planning from January 2015 through July 2018. At that point, he joined the governor's 2018 re-election campaign as Senior Advisor. Prior to joining the governor's office, Daniel served as the National Press Secretary for the National Republican Congressional Committee, the NRCC, based in Washington, D.C. Before that, he'd served as the Western Regional Press Secretary for the NRCC. He's also served as Director of Communications for the Republican majority in the Arizona House of Representatives and as a reporter, an education and political reporter for the Arizona Daily Star and editor of the Arizona Capital Times Yellow Sheet Report. Full disclosure, he's also a graduate of the University of Arizona and served as editor of the Arizona Daily Wildcat. And my co-moderator, a very good sport for this evening, Maria Polletta from the Arizona Republic. She is the state government and politics reporter for the Republic and the USA Today network. She covers the governor's office and state agencies with an emphasis on accountability of elected officials and an eye toward issues directly affecting Arizona's quality of life. She's previously covered inequality issues, city politics, and economic development for the Republic, traveling throughout Arizona and Mexico. She's also directed weekend breaking news coverage. She is an adjunct professor as well at the ASU Walter Cronkite School of Journalism and Mass Communications, focusing on journalism, ethics, and diversity. So one more round of applause for our guests. So the format is we will have opening remarks from each of our 2 guest speakers. We'll begin with Daniel and then Sarah. And then Maria and I will take turns posing hostile and aggressive questions to our 2 guests. And then in the final part of the evening, we will have Q&A from the audience. So please keep in mind questions that you might want to ask. So, Daniel.
Well, thanks, Paul. Thanks, Maria. It's great to be here. Thanks, everybody, for coming out tonight. It's appropriate that Sarah and I are engaging in civil discourse. We've been doing it a lot since the campaign ended, usually over a few beers, but we'll try to have as much fun tonight as we have then. I am currently Chief of Staff. Tonight I'm taking my Chief of Staff hat off. I'm here as a former member of the governor's re-election team and really an observer. We had a great campaign team. Many of them are here tonight, our volunteers, our staff. They really deserve the credit, starting with our deputy campaign manager, Sarah Muller, and our campaign manager, J.P. Twist. They are not here tonight, but they're 2 of really the most talented political operatives in the state, and they really deserve the credit for the win that we had on election night 2018. And really, you can't run for re-election without a great record. And our official team in the first term, some of whom are here tonight, really racked up a lot of wins for the governor in our first term, which allowed him to run on a great record. They also deserve a lot of credit, starting with our chief of staff in our first term, Kirk, who really was our team captain and got so much done, and we're very grateful to him. But you can't win a campaign without a great candidate. And we had the best candidate in Doug Ducey. And that's really, to me, when we look back at 2018, why we had the victory we did, why we had the margin we did, because he was a great candidate with a great record to run on. And you know, I joined the governor's team about 5 days after the 2014 election. And he really had this posture of saying, the election's over, and we're going to govern, and we're going to get to work. And he went, one of the first things he did was went to the National Governors Association New Governors Conference. And he talked to veteran governors, Democrat, Republican. We were facing a $1 billion budget shortfall at that time. And the message from Republican and Democrat governors was, you got to get your budget fixed, you got to take your medicine. We did that. We made a lot of tough decisions. He made a lot of tough decisions. But he was always looking at, okay, we're going to have a race in 2018, but we've got to do the right thing. We've got to govern, and that will position us well. And really, you know, I think that to me, when we look back of that posture of saying, we got to get big things done, and we're here for a short amount of time, really served him well when we got to the re-election. And we also knew early on we were not going to run a Rose Garden strategy. He was not going to be on the 9th floor. He wanted to get all over the state. He wanted to campaign. He wanted to meet people and connect with them. And I really think he did connect. I think he had a message that resonated with Arizonans. And I think that's when we look back at 2018, why we saw, you know, winning Maricopa County by 200,000 votes when many Republican statewide elected candidates had trouble carrying Maricopa County, winning Hispanic voters, according to the CNN exit poll, by 44% he received of the Hispanic vote against candidate David Garcia, and making huge inroads with women voters and other demographics that frankly, a lot of folks in my party are struggling with. So a great candidate, a winning message, and a great team. And to me, that was, for us, the recipe for success in 2018.
Great.
Sarah. Well, I have a little different perspective, of course. I came onto the campaign in February of 2018, so a little later. There had been some decisions already made. But David Garcia, I think, is a tremendous man, absolutely had the right background and expertise for the time, which was education. We struggled to raise money, which became, you know, obviously ultimately the big problem for the campaign. You know, 22 million between the governor's race and the RGA against 2 million, some of which was spent down by our primary time. I do think Daniel's absolutely correct that one of the things they did very well was keep Governor Ducey in the gubernatorial sort of lane. He did get out amongst the state, but largely when you're an incumbent with a good economy situation, that bodes well for a governor getting reelected, particularly in a changing but same party state. Our campaign focused largely on education, which was the big issue, certainly going into the campaign cycle. Invest in Ed getting derailed was a big hit, as well as you know, Governor Ducey's sort of come in a little late with the raises for teachers, but nonetheless sort of took the wind out of the sails for that time and moment.
So that was the ballot initiative.
That was the ballot initiative, yes.
Yeah, turned back by the courts.
Correct.
Yeah.
That, you know, they may go after again, who knows. So our campaign was really focused, because we didn't have money, on what we call engagement campaigns. And while it's very clear that money and persuasion is still winning, basically across the country, with the exception of very few races, I think Democrats will rapidly catch up as we engage more and more new, younger, and diverse voters. And I think our campaign, while ultimately clearly losing, did a very good job of starting to build in and cut into that new voter swath. A lot of new voter registrations We saw a lot of new voters come out, and that's something we're really proud of.
Great. Well, thank you for those opening thoughts. Maria and I are now going to exchange opportunities to pose questions. I won the coin toss, so I get the opening question. And I want to step back a little bit just to observe the phenomenon we have here and to share with the audience that the idea for this event largely came from the two of you having conversations after the campaign and becoming friends of a sort. And I would use the phrase civic friends, right? That you clearly have strong philosophical and party disagreements, which are not phony, they're quite real. But you share something, a certain set of commitments about this process of elections and the importance of public issues. So just talk, if you would, about this phenomenon that you can be really fierce opponents in a campaign and beyond a campaign about important issues, and yet you can be civic friends and decent and civil toward each other, because not everybody in American political life now thinks that this is how you should operate if you really do believe your side or your point of view. So,
Let me take that one first?
Sure.
All right.
Yeah.
Well, I do think in the era of Trump and polarizing politics, it's certainly gotten harder for people to have a civil discourse about issues. Our particular relationship, we absolutely disagree, obviously, on all kinds of things. But we also share a lot of values. You know, we come from very similar backgrounds. And I think at the end of the day, we're doing a disservice to people when we decide that to put politics over a country or politics over a state, right? And that's very difficult to not do in this environment, because I think certainly people on the Democratic side, and even cutting into wide swaths of independents right now, are very unhappy with the polarization of politics. And so it's been nice to have a relationship in which we can sort of agree to disagree, but I think our values are very similar. I think our approaches to getting there are very different. I think it's really important that we have people who continue this kind of discourse as a result of, particularly as a result of the environment now and the landscape now. We've long lost most of the statesmen or stateswomen in politics.
How was your relationship during the campaign? Or on the
Actually,
campaign
great. Yeah, I mean, I have two examples, very good examples, of Daniel being very kind to me during the campaign, and I think he probably has a few too. Certainly, we are both very competitive, and so. But it's not about us. At the end of the day, it's not about us, right? It's about our candidates' policies, our candidates' belief, and communicating those, and letting voters decide, who they want in office. And he and I are both, I think, professionals. We've done this a long time, and recognize it's not about us. I mean, we didn't spend all day tweeting back and forth at each other like some people like to do. And when we see each other at public events, it was perfectly kind and normal human behavior, I guess. But I think we're both, again, we come from similar backgrounds, and we're both polite and believe in treating people the way we'd like to be treated.
Well, we're both former reporters. We've both worked in governor's offices and on governor's campaigns and on a lot of campaigns. Most of the campaigns I've worked on have lost. So, I know the experience of both ends of the spectrum. And I also really, watched Sarah, how she conducted herself, and she was clearly a great professional communicator. And I just couldn't wait after the campaign to sit down with her and say, what did you think on debate night? And what did you do on this thing? And when we did this and da-da-da. So, I mean, I was just really curious to hear from her, her take on stuff, what was happening, and I think it was mutual. So it was just a lot of fun, and it's been really good getting to know each other, because she's right, we do have very similar backgrounds, very similar professional backgrounds that I think have allowed us to learn from each other.
Sarah, you talked about sort of the polarized environment that we're in right now. And we've certainly heard complaint. I mean, that's part of the reason we have events like this, is that we hear from voters, both on the campaign trail, I'm sure, and in the media, how frustrated they are with how divided the nation is right now. However, we also see that, you know, the negative attack ads that they complain about tend to be effective and tend to be what they remember and what they pay attention to. So I'm curious how you, whether it was in this race or others, as you know, communications professionals, navigate that when you're on the campaign trail, that sort of discrepancy or conflict between what voters say they want and what it seems like they want in practice.
Sure, I would have two things to say about that. One, I think largely in this environment, we have stopped giving voters things to vote for. Right, which is really what I believe politics and governing should ultimately be about. We are now giving people things to vote against, or perceived things to vote against. Clearly, the RGA ads, Republican Governors Association ads against David, I found personally extremely offensive. They were ranked one of the top racist ads in the country, but they were really effective. So, at the end of the day, you know, when you're making decisions, and, you know, let's not get this wrong, politics is about winning, so you can govern. You know, the sides have to do what they do.
So, again, respect, Sarah. Really, totally couldn't disagree more on this. I mean,
really.
Now it's going to get fun.
We are incredibly proud of the campaign we ran. Don't forget, the governor had a lot of support from Democrats, from Democratic mayors. Mario Diaz, who had run Janet Napolitano's campaign, worked on our campaign. We did huge outreach into the Hispanic community. We did huge outreach into a lot of communities, and really had a broad swath of support. We got the endorsement of both of the two major newspapers in the state, including the Arizona Daily Star, my former employer, and I can tell you from working there, it's pretty hard for a Republican to get the endorsement of the Arizona Daily Star. So I think that we had a positive, winning message that resonated. And again, I've worked on a lot of campaigns that have not been successful. I think saying it's all about money is what people who don't win say. I think the fact is Sarah touched on it. David did make some policy decisions and take some policy stances in his primary. I don't think that $20 million could have gotten him elected, because I don't think you can be for abolishing ICE, getting rid of the border, free college, free health care, raising taxes. I just don't think that's where Arizona is. I don't think Arizona will be there in the foreseeable future. And Kyrsten Sinema, who won, and won narrowly, but she won Maricopa County. She didn't run on any of those things. She ran a very different campaign. So I do think it was about policy. I think it was a real policy debate, and a more animated and spirited policy debate than any that I have seen in a gubernatorial race in my whole life in Arizona.
Just let Sarah reply, then I want to ask a follow-up about primary.
I mean, I would just say, I know losing campaigns blame it on money. I mean, obviously, right? But had we had money, Governor Ducey made a lot of mistakes. We came out of the primary essentially tied, and got $16 million of RGA money dropped on our heads in ads about ICE and the border. But Governor Ducey had Uber, Theranos, Trump ties, intertwined with Jim Norton, intertwined with NCIS. There were plenty of things, had we had the ability to capitalize on, I think would have put us in a better position. I don't think our stances on, for example, the Inspector General of Homeland Security, 19 ICE agents themselves, the Heritage Foundation, all also asked for reform of immigration at the time, which was what we said. Lori Roberts actually said abolish ICE. But to that point, I don't disagree necessarily that some of those positions hurt us. But I think in the face of family separations and what was going on at the time, it felt morally important for us to say something.
I want to ask a bit about something that Daniel mentioned, I think, first, which is that because the Garcia campaign had a primary contest first, that made it a very different general election campaign between an incumbent governor who didn't face a primary and a challenger who did face a primary. So my question about primaries is that one element of the polarizing of American politics, that during primaries, in each party, candidates that distinguish themselves have to move a little bit toward the edge of their party's current consensus, whichever party it is, which makes it difficult in the general election, but it also shifts the whole tone of our politics. Or is that a mistaken view?
Well, it's part of democracy. I mean, I think that you've got to stand before the voters. I mean, I will tell you that we felt the much of the campaign. I mean, David Garcia in 2014, ran a really good campaign. He was endorsed by the Arizona Chamber of Commerce. He was endorsed by 2 prior Republican superintendents of public instruction. He raised a lot of money. And in a year that was really a Republican wave, it was 2014 was actually one of the best years for Republicans in about 70 years. He almost beat Diane Douglas, and he won Maricopa County. Flash forward 4 years later, he loses Maricopa County by 200,000 votes in a year that was much better for Democrats. He ran a markedly different campaign with a markedly different message. We were watching as observers, and we felt all along that Steve Farley was the candidate we would prefer to run against. This was early on. He had a whole record in the legislature of votes, and we were looking at David Garcia and saying, wow, he was a really competitive candidate in 2014, and he is the candidate the Democrats wanted, and he's a blank slate. He didn't have votes that he had voted on. As the primary unfolded, we started to realize, in many ways, Steve Farley would have been the tougher candidate because he was running a much more moderate message in that primary, and David was taking some of these positions that I feel were really out of step with the state and ultimately cost him. The RGA ads were David's words, was him speaking at events and saying things. And I don't think if the ads were how you're characterizing them, that Governor Ducey gets 44% of the Hispanic vote in the state of Arizona. So I don't think that that's how the electorate viewed it. I think these were things that David said, and that's part of the campaign. You have to be responsible with your words and be accountable for them.
In the primary as well as the general.
Yeah, well, they were things that were said in the primary. Yeah. And I don't think he had to say them to win the primary, but he chose to. He won the primary by quite a bit.
Sarah, do you have a follow-up?
Well, I mean, the only thing I would add is one of the things that happens in Arizona is the primary is so late that by the time you're at the end of August, you really have 9 weeks of a general election, and when your opponents, largely don't have to deal with that situation. I mean, I wouldn't say our campaign spent a lot of time, honestly, thinking about the primary. We were really running against Ducey the whole time, just in that our numbers were every poll was having the other two come in under 10%. So we weren't necessarily very focused on the primary. And you watch back at our news releases, our social media, we were really coming after the governor. I think the difference sometimes when you have an incumbent versus not an incumbent, and we had a primary, you do lose some ability to push back, and you're sort of, you have to raise money, and you're dealing with a bunch of different candidates, a bunch of different angles. We had debates, we had to show up to every Democratic event, so instead of talking to undecided voters, which they had the opportunity to do all year, and probably a mistake to a certain extent on our part, although it's extremely hard to tell all these LDs you won't show up. We spend a lot of time talking to the base, and you don't win elections with the base. People go home to roost on both sides every time, and you can largely swath out independents by their voting history. And so you really have to focus on this fairly narrow group of undecided voters to win an election. And we didn't even cut in to leaning Dems. So I think there's just some, that doesn't get quite to your answer the primary, but we were pulled away from doing some of that work, which secures elections, to be honest.
Well, and I think that we really tried to run a center-right message, but we had a center-right candidate. I don't feel like we ever compromised anything the governor believed in, but he had a really appealing message, I think, to a broad scope of the electorate. There was one event I remember we did, and it was a largely Democratic audience. And one gentleman came up to the governor after the event and said, "I really like the way you talk. I'm a Democrat. You didn't once mention Republicans or Democrats." So I do think that, we felt like we really had a message and a record that was appealing. There were people who told the governor, don't engage in school safety. I mean, he really wanted to do it. There were people who thought that it would be a net negative for him to do it. He felt passionately about doing it. I think ultimately it was an issue that voters really cared about, and that we were able, to talk about a lot out on the campaign trail. So we just felt like we were in a place where we could go into any room in the state and had a message that really would resonate.
Just before I turn it over to Maria, the trick of striking a balance between giving voters something to vote for, which would probably be healthier for governing after a campaign, and winning. So in theory, both of you accept the idea that a degree of negativity and destructiveness in a campaign makes it very difficult to recover after the campaign for a whole political community. But there are day-to-day decisions you have to make about what to do with your communication message, with your advertising, about crossing a line in some way. I mean, Dan, you used the phrase, the governor wanted to be able to turn from campaigning to governing after his first election. But it could be that it's not so easy to do that, depending on how you run the campaign, what the content of the campaign is.
Well, I'm probably sharing too many secrets here and going to get in trouble after this, but I think one thing they did really smart was the bus. I thought the school bus was really smart, and I think it did hit a chord where it was a memorable thing about David Garcia. We prepared for a campaign about K-12 education. I think that David took the election in a different direction. We weren't planning in the fall to be talking about border security, but I felt like the Netroots event in New Orleans injected that in and really took it off of K-12 education, which I felt was their wheelhouse. But so I do think what the candidates say matters. It steers the direction of the campaign, and the campaign took a surprising turn towards an issue when we thought that they would be talking all through the summer and fall about K-12 education.
I don't disagree with that. However, I mean, at that point, we're trying to raise money. But I do think, again, without the money to amplify your message or other messages, you really just fall. Earned media, no offense to any newspapers or earned media here, but is largely digested, just as debates are, by decided voters. So again, you're trying to talk to undecided voters. And we did take a turn there into immigration, largely because the national situation with Trump and the separation of children at the border, we felt very strongly about whether other Arizonans, clearly they did not, but that was a real decision based on a real moral value that we held. So
I wanted to ask a quick follow-up question before I get to my main question, because you talked about running center-right, but something that Governor Ducey had to contend with was sort of walking a line when you had a fragmented Republican Party, where you had folks, at least in Arizona, who were more of the John McCain type Republican, and then you had others who were very pro-Trump. Mm-hmm. You also had Senator McCain pass away right around the time of the primary. So how did the governor during his re-election campaign, or you all as his team, navigate that when you had some splinters within your own party?
Yeah, well, it's a really good question. I do think that in federal races, this is much more challenging. I mean, we really tried to stick to our job, as the governor says, his day job here in the state of Arizona. And I think that that governors largely, the other thing the governor always says is you never see two governors on a split screen on cable news. I mean, governors, there is a congeniality between governors, and I just think it's a very different job than being a senator or a congressman. So we felt like the issue set that we got done in the first term really was one that had a broad appeal. And we also felt that we were able to really build some relationships with Democrats and get things done with Democrats that was positive, but didn't alienate anyone. We never compromised our principles. And then right out the gate after, and Paul, this might go to your question, I mean, the first thing we did after the election was go into legislative session and pass a major water bill, first in 40 years, unanimous on the most controversial political issue, some would say, in the state. And we did it with the help of Democrats, and we brought them in early. So we felt like we had a record where we were able to go to Democrats and say, we'd like your support. And they supported us. Mayor Uribe in Douglas, who's a Democrat, border town. He's done a lot of great stuff down there, and he was a big supporter of our campaign. So I don't know if that answers the question, but we didn't feel in any way compromised. We didn't feel that we were getting caught in that debate, because we really felt we could go in any room in the state and the governor could say, here's what I'm doing. And it was just a winning agenda and a winning message.
Taking a step back and getting a little broader again, how does, you mentioned Twitter and tweeting, how has social media and the 24/7 news cycle that we now have changed campaigning?
You want me to take that? Well, I would say two things. I mean, there's growing distrust about social media, right? But certainly that's more of a new thing. I think social media is largely a bubble thing. It's mostly us talking to each other, trying to push stuff out to reporters. I mean, not in its entirety, right? We all run digital ads and those kinds of things. But I think social media itself is sort of a sidebar. The 24-hour news cycle lends itself to people who are very ideologically aligned with Fox or MSNBC, and those people digest that news, right? And it's also definitely been a conduit to a more polarizing environment, in my opinion, which makes our jobs, significantly different in that, you touched on this a little bit, but for me, Ducey standing next to Trump at rallies and Trump's extreme rhetoric around people of color and women and those kinds of things are playing out in the 24-hour news cycle, but yet in states we're not really able to capitalize on some of that or tying those things to each other. But I think again, I'll just go back to the basic premise that voters who are Republican or Democrat are largely who consume news, and undecided voters largely consume advertising, and social media is really a bubble game by and large, would be my take on it.
Yeah, it does feel like we're talking to ourselves sometimes. I think that it matters to the media. I mean, I do think it's tough. I think it would be almost a political malpractice if you do what we do for a living and say, I'm going to shut down my Twitter account. Because it's where the media is, and it's where I think you need to be engaging in making the case for your ideas. And so, you have to pay attention to it. I think you can't obsess with it. But I do think that in terms of, when you're working for an elected official in a governor's office, a mayor's office, it is, I think, a way to communicate directly with voters now. Obviously, the president has done that better than anybody. We have really tried to use our platforms in a way that is positive and engaging. And I will say, because you brought up the Trump rally, I guess what I would say of why and this goes to your earlier question, I mean, we did go to that rally, and the governor, supported the president. And we also stood next to Robert Uribe, the mayor of Douglas. So we felt like we talked to all Arizonans, that we weren't afraid to go into any room or any audience. And I think, to me, in the state of Arizona, which is a state that's changing a lot, that is very independent-minded, having that attitude of that you need to make your case for your ideas, and that I think people do want a reasonable message and want to know how you're going to get things done, I think is really important.
You mentioned another example of governing after an election. The regional water compromise and the specific legislation that Arizona had to pass as part of that sort of federal compact. And I again come back to this question: is it fair to say that governing is about forging compromises within party coalitions, then across party coalitions, and how difficult is it to do that if a median, you're saying most people who self-identify as Republican or Democrat are watching news, but the news, the television news, and I guess talk radio is very polarizing. How does that make it difficult to actually govern and compromise if the voters you're trying to communicate with are hearing very polarized messages, not from your campaigns, but from news sources?
Well, I mean, having been in a governor's office just like Daniel for a long time, there's no question that you are calling down members of the other party to get deals done, right? You cannot, I mean, we're in a red trifecta, so it's slightly different for you, although there's some problematic legislators on your side that I assume from time to time you have to make deals with. In Montana, we were a Democratic governor, although Democrats look very different there, with a Republican legislature, and we managed to pass full-time kindergarten, a renewable portfolio standard, Indian education for all, bison hunting, wolf hunting, all kinds of things that were compromises, because we were willing to sort of both give and take a little. And I think to be good governing does that. Good governing, once you're elected, should do the best for the greatest number, right? You shouldn't govern from a position of complete ideology. You should govern from a position of sort of making deals and moving toward the middle a little bit. Now, that's impossible completely to do, nor should you completely do it, because you got elected to do what you say you're going to do. But I think there's no way to be an effective governor and not make some compromises. There just isn't.
Well, I think that's right. I mean, we have 31 of 60 seats in the House and 17 of 30 in the Senate. So it's not like we've got super majorities in the Arizona legislature. And so we do work with the other side. And we have great relationships with the Democratic leaders and with Democratic members. And I talked about the water legislation, and some of the members of our team who actually got the policy done and negotiated are here. They deserve the credit. But I wish people could have seen it. I almost wish we could have live streamed it, although then it may have gone differently.
That's my point in part, right?
We had in the 8th floor conference room of the governor's office, the governor, Charlene Fernandez, the Democratic leader in the House, Rusty Bowers, Speaker of the House, David Bradley, Senate Democratic leader, and Karen Fann, the President of the Senate, in the room all day on a Saturday, talking through issues, negotiating in the room, saying, I'll give up this, I'll give your members that, because they saw the importance of getting that done and what it meant for the state. So to me, it was a very inspiring moment where a job like this is very gratifying, because you see that and you realize, well, we have great people in elected office that care, that are willing to do the right thing, and that actually can, this can happen. And I think it happens more at the state level than at the federal level. But I just think we've got a great track record in Arizona of doing this. And part of it is just treating people with respect, and we've really tried to do that. I mean, we don't, we engage in a really positive way with members on both sides of the aisle, and it's not always easy, but it's part of the job, and I think it's an important part, and it's one where the governor has really set that vision as a role model of what he wants the tone and tenor of our administration to be. So I think that's really important.
To that point, and talking about making compromises, and I know you can't really reveal, all the specifics of what happens behind the scenes, but is there more compromise happening than the public sees? Because, we're hearing from you, Governor, and we hear from the Governor, open door policy, bringing in Democratic legislators, and then we hear from Democrats, we've been shut out, we're not getting a say, there's back and forth, like you mentioned, between Republican lawmakers within the same party. So, in terms of the public having hope in the process, with state and local politics, is there more compromise happening than maybe some of the posturing would lead the public to believe?
Well, I don't know if I'd use the word compromise so much as open dialogue. I don't feel like anyone is compromising their sincerely held philosophical beliefs, and nor should they. If you're starting in a position of wanting somebody to cave on all their principles, you're just not going to get anything done, and I think that's the mistake that some folks make. If you're willing to say, okay, here's an issue where we can appeal to the other side, where there is an opportunity, then I think you can find those opportunities, and it does happen. And I think that, most of the legislation we pass is bipartisan, and some of the big issues, the Opioid Act, the water legislation, have been bipartisan, and it's really, we couldn't have gotten that done if we hadn't brought everyone in and said, how can we do this together? The teacher pay raise was also bipartisan, and so really any good thing, any big thing we've done has largely been done through Republicans and Democrats working together. Now, there's also the political theater. And sometimes people say, look, I'm going to have to say publicly this. I have my constituency. And if you're willing to accept that and not be so interested in the immediate gratification of getting all the credit on everything, then you can get a lot done. There's some quote about if you don't want the credit, you can get a lot done. And it's true.
Yeah. Do you have a thought on
that?
No,
I would echo that. I think that's very accurate in terms of, once you get into office, other than I think the education bill only had one Democratic vote. Steve Farley, because he was trying to beat up on us.
No, there were more than
okay. I could be wrong.
We named them all off in the state of the state. So. I didn't watch,
sorry. But I think that's right. I think that you don't give up your principles or your core values. I think that's, in fact, what makes it, good in compromising, right? You're not compromising your core values. You're compromising for the betterment of the state, and you're reaching decisions that don't, that feel good, largely. But of course, political theater plays out. It's supposed to. It's actually the most fun part of our job, to be honest, at least in my opinion. In some ways, is to get something really great done and then sort of have a little fun with it.
And to that point about not compromising core values, I'm interested in, whether it's with governing when you're a policy advisor or if you're a communications professional on a campaign, how you approach it when you feel very differently about something than the candidate does or the official does.
You weren't a reporter here yet when I was a reporter, but I was known as
Just missed each other.
I was known as one of the more annoying reporters.
You don't say.
It's a badge of honor.
Just kidding.
So for the governor to choose someone like that as chief of staff, he's got to be open to a lot of feedback and give and take. And that's why I love working for the guy. I mean, he does not want yes men. He wants to get candid feedback. I feel like I can always share my opinion, even if it's going to be different than his. And then ultimately, he was the one elected by the voters. He'll make the decision, and you need to fall in line. But for me, the really just the open dialogue that he encourages in our office and amongst our senior staff, he takes our input and wants it and solicits it from agency directors. Really just makes it, when you do a job like this and you've got the background I have, really easy because you never have to worry about disagreeing with him, and that really helps a lot.
How about other campaigns you've been on, though?
Well, everybody's different. I mean, I would say that's rare. That's rare. I will tell you one thing that I think that when you look back and think, is there something that maybe we would have done differently and maybe an area of disagreement? I mean, I think that we as staff thought, let's do two debates. Let's do two debates. And afterwards, and I think he wanted to do more debates. And I think looking back, we should have done more debates. I think the debates were good. I think he did great in the debates. And so I think we would have done more debates, not less. But he's one that if you've got something on your mind and you're not sharing it, then he sees you as doing him a disservice.
How about you, Sarah?
I've had the same experience. Governor Schweitzer, in fact, we would daily get into some knockdown trackouts. He was much more fiery. But same thing. He didn't want yes people. He wanted us to push back. I was always playing devil's advocate. We would run through every question we thought a reporter would ask. Are we answering it correctly? Are we leaving ourselves a mouse hole in case it doesn't go so well? All of those things. And he would always say, look, don't come to me with a problem, come to me with 3 solutions. So we had a very open dialogue, I think sounds similar to what you have. I have worked for people that are not so open, and that becomes a real challenge. David Garcia was receptive to feedback, and in all the cases, anyone I've ever worked for, we've had disagreements. I've said this is what I think, they've said this is what I think, and at the end of the day, it doesn't matter. My job is to walk out that door and deliver what they ask me to do. So ultimately, they're the ones accountable to the voters, not me, and so that's what you do.
Closing question for me. We're in a university setting, so I want to ask you a difficult question about the voters you would prefer to have. This is just between us. Be honest with us. So we're educators here at Arizona State University. We do think about helping the debate in this state and beyond about civic education, especially public school civic education, to prepare people to be informed, capable, and participating citizens. So what are we doing wrong in schools, and what are we doing wrong in universities? Be honest, what kind of voters would you really like to have out there to communicate with in campaigns? Or are they just perfect, the voters out there? They don't need to be any more informed or engaged or anything like that.
Well, I mean, I'll go back to my first point, which is just, I think it's incumbent on us to start giving voters things to vote for again, largely. I mean, we're creating this environment of cynicism to some extent. But, we're certainly seeing a lot of young, more diverse voters coming into our party, and we'll take them.
I would say I want more voters, more people voting, more people engaged. I think the thing that's great about this school is the focus on civil discourse, and the focus on civics. I think more people knowing about our history. These are all issues that the governor cares a lot about, of making sure that kids understand history, understand our founding principles, and are civically engaged. I mean, I think that the folks, many of them who are here, who helped us win, were ASU students, young people who got involved in the campaign. So I think that when I was in college, which was during the 2000 election, young people were totally disengaged. They were not interested.
Absolutely.
And now I feel like young people are really engaged. They're working on these campaigns. I think it's great, and I think we need more of it.
Should we be doing more particularly on the question of digital age media literacy? We talked a bit about ads or information that one campaign might think is inaccurate, unfair, but there's a national debate about false information, easily detectable, fraudulent information. Do we in schools and in universities need to spend a little bit more time about that, which could make things difficult for not campaigns maybe, but for third-party sources of information? Or is that just noise for you? You don't really worry about that?
I mean, I think you should spend some time on it. I mean, I think part of what we're both saying is, you want a young electorate or young people to look at all of these issues and make up their own mind about what's best for their future, right? And that takes some education around misleading advertising. It takes some education around policy issues. It takes some education around what it means to be, I think more and more of us are like, what does it mean to be a Republican or a Democrat or an independent? Because the parties both have brought, our party certainly has started to, the Republican Party has for a long time had these sort of broader extremes on either side, and I think most of us fall somewhere in the middle of the spectrum. So I think educating young people about that and about, Facebook and some of those things are starting to really emerge as potentially, I think, dangerous to our democracy. So I do think that's an important point to make.
Well, some of it's in the eye of the beholder. I loved the RGA ads. She did. Different people are going to have different perspectives. I would say that I think the voters are smarter than we sometimes give them credit for, having sat through hours and hours of focus groups over the last decade plus. I will tell you that people know something is phony when they see it, and that stuff usually doesn't work. So I think the voters can tell this stuff. I think that the media is really important. And one thing, not to put her on the spot, but I've given Maria credit for this before, is I have no idea what her views are. I have no idea who she wanted to win our campaign, but she covered it. And she doesn't share her views on the Twitter sphere. That isn't true for everyone anymore in the media. And I do think the media are the referees. They should be the referees calling the balls and strikes, and I think we need more of that, and we need that trust in the media to be telling the story and to be doing it in a way where people say, okay, that's objective, and I can believe that. And I think that's a little bit lost in what you're talking about what we see on cable news and whatnot, and that's, I think, one of the more unfortunate things of where we are today.
I think it's absolutely essential to be teaching media literacy, if I can jump in. One thing I wanted to mention but didn't want to interrupt, Daniel talked about the Arizona Republic endorsing Governor Ducey for re-election. The editorial board is completely separate from what I do, which is on the reporting side, and not everybody understands the distinction. I take heat for some of the opinion columns that come out that I, have no idea what they're going to say until until everybody else does. And so I think it's really critical to democracy, not to put too fine a point on it, that people can tell the difference, not so much with ads, but with news, what's actually fair, what's objective. I don't know if there's such a thing as absolutely no bias, because as a reporter, you're making decisions every step along the way, right? What do you cover? Who do you talk to? Which quotes do you include? That sort of thing. But objectivity you can definitely have, and recognizing that, I think, is critical among voters.
Great. That was much more interesting than anything they had to say.
Hey now.
That was really very good.
You got your next.
Yeah, there we go. Yeah. Okay, well, at this point, enough of Maria and me. So we're now to the second part where we have some questions from the audience.
My name is Cameron. I'm a student here in the School of Civic and Economic Thought and Leadership. What I wanted to ask was, as a first-year student here, I've noticed a lot of issues with bringing up the conversation about politics in such a polarized era here on the college campus. How do you suggest that students like myself who want to be civically engaged bring up the conversation about politics and voting to other students who might not necessarily be passionate like I am?
Thoughts?
You want me to take it? Well, Cameron, that's a very good question and a very important one in an educational environment. I'm not sure how you bring it up exactly, except to say, sometimes, when we sit down, we'll joust a little bit about something fun and then say, look, I know we disagree on this, but I'm really curious your thinking, right? So one of the ways I learned to do what I do is by arguing with my Republican Dallas Cowboy loving uncles, right? So I do think that, while you don't need to argue with people, it's really interesting to understand their perspectives, and it helps you refine your thinking as well. Daniel and I would disagree on almost everything, but when I listen to how he talks about something or he listens to how I talk about something, it helps me understand maybe how better to counter his argument, or maybe how better to accept part of that view into my view. So I think it's being respectful.
Awesome.
At the end of the day. Yeah, I think
Co-sign that.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
that's good bipartisanship.
Yeah.
Hello. So recently, Twitter banned paid-for political ads, as Facebook did not. And so do you think that's going to change some of the strategies that you have used in past tactics in past campaigns? Do you think it's going to make Twitter and some of the ads and what people say on their accounts more relevant? Or do you think you're going to turn more towards Facebook and other platforms that are still allow paid for ads?
Good question.
Well, I would say we did a lot with Facebook with a lot of success. And I think Twitter, to me, is much more of this kind of the dialogue, the chattering class. So I thought it was interesting they did that. I don't know that it would have had a huge impact, at least on our strategy that we deployed. I think Facebook is really effective, especially with the voters in Arizona that were important in this race and that will be important moving forward. And I think there's a lot of ways to get across. I mean, typically in the past, you'd just buy a bunch of broadcast TV. I think these digital platforms are really important. I think digital TV is really important when you think about, where we all get our news and entertainment. I'd be interesting to know how many people actually have a cable coming into their house. So I think that the whole way we communicate is changing. We really did a lot of that in this campaign, and I think this was the first cycle where you saw campaigns make a big investment in that, and I think you need to now. So I think you're going to see more of it on Facebook and these other avenues.
I agree. I do find the policy of Facebook to be offensive, and I'm glad that Twitter banned ads. Just in that you can say anything. That policy is not a good one for democracy, in my opinion. But agreed that we'll keep doing it.
Hello, my name is Judah Waxbaum. I'm the chairman of Arizona College Republicans. I'm proud to say as chairman here at ASU, the Young Democrats and College Republicans have a great bipartisan relationship. But as I'm sure we all know, that's not the national model. So I'm curious, in your opinions, what steps do we need to take as a society or a nation in that matter to get closer to what we have here at ASU?
Mm-hmm. Well, that's a great question. Do you mind if I take that first? Part of it is recognizing what we talked about earlier. There's the campaign and there's governing. In a campaign, you put on your jersey. And we wouldn't disparage each other for supporting Democrats or Republicans. It's then what comes next. I mean, our opponent in our first campaign, the governor's first campaign, was Fred Deval. He is now on the Arizona Board of Regents. The governor appointed him to the Arizona Board of Regents. He worked in Bruce Babbitt's administration. He's been a Democrat for decades, and he's a great guy, and we've got some real shared priorities around higher ed and some of these other issues. So I think it's recognizing that, hey, guess what? In the campaign, the college Republicans are going to be doing everything they can to get Republicans elected, but there's something that comes after Election Day, and that's what happens next. And I think we've got some real models of that in the state. I certainly think the governor's a model for it, but I think there's other people who are walking the talk on that, and then also realizing that it's not personal, and that these are policy issues, these are issues, but at the end of the day, that it's not personal that we disagree.
Yeah, I mean, I would echo that. I think that's exactly right. And I would go back to what I said, I think, to Cameron's question, and that is just that engage on values, right? Like, issues divide and values unite, right? At the end of the day, I think a lot of us believe, our kids should have a good education. People should have access to health care. Those kinds of things we certainly don't disagree on. We disagree on how to get there, I think, or what that model might look like. But I think engaging with each other on the real questions and problems of our time and talking about how you might solve them, working together would be a huge step in the right direction.
Gotcha. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
I had a question for the both of you regarding how each of you has handled political extremism within your parties, and furthermore, what have you found that either subdues or encourages the growth of political radicalism within the parties? And I'm just to be clear here, I want to hear about kind of like within the party politics of that kind of polarization from within the party rather than from without in the broader.
You're going to let me take that one first? Of course you are. Well, I would say our party has long thought of itself as a big tent. Yours probably does too. And there have always been tensions. You're right, it's gotten more extreme. I guess from my perspective, I look at a Senator Sinema, and she won, right? Mm-hmm. And she won by running an extremely disciplined campaign. And while a lot of Democrats don't necessarily agree with her voting record now in the U.S. Senate, I think a lot of Arizonans do. So, on one hand, we have to deal with that within our own party, and the progressive pushback to that isn't wrong, and I don't think we should treat it as wrong. I think when we have sort of extremes within the party on either side, it pushes the rest of us to some sort of middle agreement. And I think where you'll find the real statesmen or the real people who get a lot done come out of that. For example, AOC has made Nancy Pelosi look very moderate, which has been helpful, right? I mean, that's been helpful. So,
Well, it's interesting because I feel like in the working in Republican politics, I mean, it's for a while, I mean, really decades, that the Republican Party has been, as you described, a big tent where you have a lot of different people who, you have national security conservatives, you have fiscal conservatives, you have social conservatives, and we have to kind of find a way to come together, kumbaya, on Election Day and get to 50+1. The Democrats, I think, have largely been more united on issues in modern times, and I feel like we're now seeing a change in that where there is more of a debate within the party of which direction do we go, what do we want to be. Part of that, I think, is what happens when you're out of power, but I also think that there is a disagreement in terms of the direction. So I think that it's something, at least on the Republican side of the aisle, that I think there are people who might have a view that one might consider extreme on one issue, but on another issue might have a position that is in line with someone else. So I think part of it is it's hard to put people in these buckets, and it's hard to kind of label, and I think we get in some danger when we try to do that.
Thank you.
People are complicated.
Yeah.
So I know the last thing you guys probably want to talk about is the 2020 presidential election. However, I am very curious about it considering Arizona's role in that. not trying to out myself politically, but I worked in the 2016 election, and I was surprised how close it came in Arizona. And you guys referred to Arizona as a changing state. What dynamics do you see changing in Arizona, and how do you think your respective parties will address those dynamics when it comes to 2020?
Sure. I mean, I think we have a very polarizing president right now, right? And you've seen his approval ratings kind of do this in Arizona. They've stayed relatively around 50%. I think it was the Washington Post yesterday, though, had Biden up 3 on him, Sanders up 1, and Elizabeth Warren up 2. So I definitely think you're seeing Democrats make inroads, both because we're bringing along younger and a more diverse electorate, which I've talked about a few times, but also, there's a lot of anti-Trump backlash right now. And so I definitely think that will play into the 2020 election, as will what our candidates decide to do. Some of them are running very far to the left as well. So I think Arizona will sort of have to wrangle with those things a little bit, certainly in the state, in all the swing states for that matter. So I think it's a little early to tell how it'll play out completely. Sure. But early polling tends to hold fairly true moving all the way through the election. So I think this state will be somewhat of a toss-up.
Yeah, I think one thing we know is all of our predictions will be wrong.
Like in 2016.
When I worked at the NRCC, we had in the lobby a picture of Time magazine the day after the 2008 election, and it was the Republican elephant with a thing over it saying extinct. And 2 years later, the cover of Time was a picture of John Boehner that said, "Hello, Mr. Speaker." So, all of this is unpredictable. I think in terms of Arizona, we are a rapidly growing and changing state. But I think we'd be fools to say this is what it's going to look like in 2 years or 4 years and 6 years, because it all depends on who's coming here. And I also think that we do need to persuade voters. It doesn't matter what side is on. We can't take voters for granted, and we can't just expect that they're going to vote a certain way. But Arizona, I think, will be very competitive. The president won by 3 points last time. Jeff Flake in 2012, he won by 3 points. There isn't a huge natural advantage. We've almost had this reputation of being a redder state than we are. So it will be competitive. It depends on who the Democrats nominate. I think these debates are really entertaining. It's hard to know which ones are the Saturday Night Live and which are the real ones, because they're.
Hey.
So it depends on who they nominate. I mean, I do think they're taking some really wacky positions that are going to hurt them in a state like this come November. So.
Excellent. Thank you, guys.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So the Arizona State Constitution empowers its citizens by allowing for recall elections, election of judges, and voter-made law through the initiative process. Yet we still see very low voter turnout in state and local elections. So how important is that for voters to take advantage of these unique opportunities?
You're talking about to take advantage of a recall, or?
Just opportunities for voters to get more involved in the democratic process.
Yeah, well, I think they should get more involved. I mean, only good things come from voters getting more involved. Competitive elections are a good thing. We need more of them. We need more voter engagement. We need more. We need a strong media that questions what we do. So I think we need more voter engagement, and anything we can do to make that happen is going to make us a stronger state and stronger country.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. I do think when you're in the minority party, or you're on the progressive spectrum or the far right spectrum, the ballot is one of the only ways to do things, and particularly on taxes and things like that, given, was it Prop 206? I'm going to get it wrong.
We've
but
got an attorney in the back somewhere.
That requires, I think it's 2/3 the legislature, and that makes it difficult fiscally should a problem arise. But generally speaking, I think he's exactly right. The more engagement we can get, the better across the board.
So my questions relate to the actual title of this program, Connecting with Arizona Voters specifically. So it's kind of two-pronged. How would you address people that lack the political efficacy to even register to vote, let alone actually vote in elections? And once you get past that initial stage, how would you suggest that people kind of wade through all the information that is available for them to be able to discern maybe like what side that they're planning on taking or what side they're voting on if they're coming from no actual political basis, there's no political knowledge instilled in them at all?
Yes, sir. Okay. So low propensity voters are very heavily focused on, at least by our party, both registering them, getting them on the PEVL with permanent voting list, and then turning them out. You still see fairly low numbers among low propensity voters, but if you keep doing it year after year, that increases, and it's really hard work, but it's really important work. And then in terms of voter education, I think both parties sort of strive to do that, and part of that's persuasion in campaign ads, which isn't quite voter education, but you have a lot of issue advocacy nonprofits. We encourage relational organizing, which is talking to your family and friends about issues and how they might vote. Voter guides can be very helpful to people. They break down information into fairly digestible means for people who don't know a lot about it. And that's what I think the bottom line is, to continue to engage.
I think a lot of people are turned off by politics right now, and a lot of it is just going to come from electing good people. It doesn't matter what party, but good people who have good intentions, who can help rebuild some trust in government and in democracy. And it's not new. I think we've seen this now for a couple decades. But I think, if we want to get people engaged, it is going to take some, obviously, personal responsibility on their end. But I think the idea of leaders in elected office building trust, showing they can work with each other, they can get things done, and that people don't just say, oh well, that's just politics and it doesn't impact me, because it does impact them.
Final question.
Hi, my name is Betsabe Ayala, and my question to both of you is, what is your intake on special interest groups? How do you feel they impacted the election for the governor's race? Well,
it's, I think, in the eye of the beholder. There's groups that she loves that I don't love, that supported David Garcia and vice versa. I do think that it's important, and this is something, having been involved in a lot of federal races across the country, a lot of congressional races, and here at the state level and gubernatorial and other races, is the candidate has to be able to stand on their own 2 feet. We can talk all day long about outside ads and outside advertising. A candidate needs to have their own positive message that they can take to the voters in order to be successful. And there's been campaigns that I've been involved in where you think you can parachute in from Washington, D.C., run a bunch of ads, and you're going to win the election, a bunch of negative ads. It just doesn't work. There's no evidence of it. A candidate needs to have a positive message, take it to the voters, and if they don't have that, people do need something to vote for. And so I think that there are these outside groups that come in, but ultimately the candidate's message is really important.
I would agree with what he said, with the exception of, I really think after Citizens United in particular, special interests and corporations have had significantly more power or ability to persuade in elections. And I do think that's been to the detriment largely of the working or middle class people. They still have a right to vote, they still have the messaging, but they get turned off by that, right? So I think that's, for me, where the real interplay comes in. Thank you. Thank you for your question.
Thank you for all the questions. Thank you all for participating in the Civic Discourse Project, which airs regularly on Arizona PBS. And if you enjoyed this conversation, we hope you will listen to our school's podcast called Keeping It Civil, which you can find on iTunes and Podbean and any playhouse you find podcasts. In the podcast, we feature in-depth conversations with the speakers we have in the Civic Discourse Project. So on behalf of Arizona State University and my colleagues in the School of Civic and Economic Thought and Leadership, and our special guest tonight, thank you and good night.
Terrific.